Imagine the quiet, sun-drenched city of Alexandria, standing bright and proud upon the Egyptian coast, a testament to Greek ambition and intellectual fervor. At its heart lay the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, and within its complex, the Great Library, a creation born not of necessity, but of sheer, boundless intellectual appetite. It was a place where the air itself seemed to vibrate with the silent weight of knowledge, where every shadow held a history, and every sunbeam illuminated the promise of discovery. We begin our long, slow journey here, in the golden haze of its glorious dawn, a time when its very existence was a quiet, powerful miracle. The library was the brainchild of the early Ptolemaic rulers, established in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Ptolemy I, Sota, a general of Alexander the Great, and his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, held a vision unlike any before, to collect every written work in the world, to gather all knowledge into a single, magnificent repository. This was an ambition of cosmic scale, a quiet, scholarly endeavor that dwarfed the military conquests of their ancestors. The very structure of the library complex was designed to encourage quiet contemplation and boundless research. It was not a dusty repository or a simple storage facility. It was an entire university, a sanctuary for the mind. Imagine the wide, smooth marble corridors, cooled against the heat of the Egyptian sun, corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, lined with silent statues of great thinkers and scholars. There was the grand dining hall, a place where the resident scholars, the philologi, would gather for their communal, quiet meals, their conversations often drifting from mathematics to metaphysics, from poetry to Ptolemaic politics. These scholars were the lifeblood of the library, living and working within its walls, their entire existence dedicated to the pursuit of truth. They were paid handsome salaries, exempted from taxes, and provided with servants and accommodation, a quiet luxury intended to free their minds from the distractions of the world outside. This quiet patronage of the mind was the very foundation of the library's initial success. They spent their days within the vast, cavernous halls where the scrolls were stored, the famous bibliotheca. These halls were immense, lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, each one holding hundreds of tightly rolled papyrus scrolls. The air within these chambers was dry and constant, carefully managed to protect the delicate papyrus from the humid coastal air, a constant, quiet work of preservation. Imagine the subtle, earthy aroma that permeated these halls, the pervasive scent of aged papyrus, the dry, slightly sweet fragrance of the cedar oil used to preserve the rolls, and the quiet, metallic scent of the ink. This smell was the breath of the library itself, a scent that spoke of centuries of thought and the patient accumulation of human wisdom. The scrolls were not simply dumped into the collection. A systematic, meticulous process of acquisition and organization was implemented. A quiet, scholarly discipline that set the library apart. Agents were sent across the known world with vast sums of gold, instructed to purchase or copy every scroll they could find. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's famous harbor was searched, and any scroll found on board was seized copied by the library's professional scribes, and the copy returned to the owner, while the original, often deemed superior, was added to the Mouseion's collection. This was the famous ship's scroll seizure, a quiet, systematic act of intellectual appropriation that underscored the Ptolemies' relentless dedication to their collecting mandate. The sheer scale of the collection grew to be staggering. While exact figures are lost to time, contemporary estimates suggest the library held hundreds of thousands of individual scrolls, perhaps approaching 500,000 or more. A vast, quiet ocean of human thought. The scholar's primary work was not just reading, but establishing the text. This was the era of textual criticism, a painstaking, methodical process that required immense patience. Scribes would compare multiple copies of the same work, often written over centuries, to identify errors, corruptions, and later additions. Imagine a scholar, seated at a quiet, smooth wooden desk, the light filtering in from a high window, his concentration absolute, unrolling one fragile scroll after another, his quill poised above a fresh sheet of papyrus. He is meticulously comparing word against word, comma against comma, seeking the original, pristine voice of the ancient author. It was here that the works of Homer were edited and standardized into the versions we know today. A monumental, quiet effort that saved the foundational texts of Greek civilization from oblivion. This methodical, painstaking work was the height of the library's golden age, a time when the pursuit of pure, unadulterated knowledge was the highest virtue. The quiet rhythm of the scholars' lives set the tempo for the city's intellectual life. It was a rhythm of reading, comparison, discussion, and slow, deliberate writing. The very air in the Mouseion complex seemed thick with the palpable energy of intense, yet quiet, thought. The library, in these early centuries, was a true powerhouse of innovation. Here, Euclid formalized the principles of geometry, a quiet revolution in mathematical thought. Here, Eratosthenes accurately calculated the circumference of the earth, using nothing but simple geometry, the shadow of a stick, and a profound, quiet grasp of cosmic scale. Here, Hero of Alexandria invented rudimentary steam-powered devices and complex mechanical toys, a quiet testament to the boundless creativity fostered within its walls. The Mouseion complex was a quiet, self-contained universe, a place where the world's knowledge was not only preserved but actively pushed forward. The Ptolemies, in their initial fervor, understood that the preservation of scrolls was only half the battle. The expansion of knowledge was the ultimate prize. The quiet pride of the first Ptolemies was inextricably linked to the shining reputation of their library. It was their ultimate status symbol, a quiet declaration to the world that Alexandria was the true heir to the intellectual legacy of Greece. But even in this golden haze, the very seeds of the library's eventual decline were subtly sown. The vast expense required to maintain such a colossal undertaking, the endless salaries, the cost of papyrus, the goal for new acquisitions, the constant need for preservation and recopying was staggering. This immense financial burden, once cheerfully borne by the early, intellectually ambitious Ptolemies, would eventually become a heavy, cumbersome yoke for their less inspired, later descendants. The reliance on the state, while providing stability, also introduced the subtle, ever-present danger of political interference. The library's fate was now irrevocably tied to the quiet whims, the political fortunes, and the intellectual caliber of the ruling dynasty. The scholars, for all their tax exemptions and privileges, were ultimately dependent on the royal purse, making their quiet, intellectual freedom contingent on the stability of the throne. The glorious dawn was also the quiet setting of the sun, and the first shadows, long and cool, were already beginning to stretch across the marble floors of the Mouseion complex. The initial vibrancy of the Great Library, a quiet, powerful energy that defined its golden age, began its slow, subtle corrosion not with a bang, but with a quiet, nearly imperceptible sigh of changing priorities. The intellectual fire that characterized the first two, that boundless desire to collect and create, began to cool under their successors. The sheer novelty of the project wore off, and the reality of the monumental financial strain began to press heavily on the royal treasury, the maintenance of the vast collection, the endless need for conservation, the constant wages for hundreds of scholars and thousands of scribes, represented an annual expenditure of staggering proportions. This funding, once seen as an investment in eternal glory, slowly began to be viewed as a costly line item, a quiet burden on a state, increasingly focused on military campaigns, palace intrigues, and the maintenance of a luxurious court. The subtle corrosion began with a slight tightening of the royal purse strings, a quiet reduction in the lavishness of the scholars' stipends, a small delay in the payment of their salaries. These were not dramatic cuts, but small, cumulative deprivations that chipped away at the quality of life and the peace of mind necessary for deep scholarly work. The intellectual freedom of the scholars, once absolute, began to face subtle constraints. The later Ptolemies, less interested in philosophy and more concerned with personal power, sometimes saw the library's intellectuals not as brilliant assets, but as potential political liabilities. Ptolemy VIII. Physcon, a man noted for his cruelty and lack of intellectual grace, provides the first clear, sharp instance of this political meddling. A quiet violence directed at the very heart of the institution. Around 145 BCE, Physcon, who himself had little love for learning, grew suspicious of the Mouseion scholars. He saw them as an elite, politically influential group who might favor his rivals. In a swift, quiet purge, he expelled a vast number of the leading philologoi and intellectuals from Alexandria. This was a cultural wound of profound severity, a devastating brain drain enacted not by a foreign invader, but by the city's own king. The scholars were scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, taking their knowledge, their research, and their intellectual energy with them. While this dispersal inadvertently helped spread Alexandrian learning, it crippled the library's resident intellectual community, leaving its halls quieter, emptier, and less vibrant. The continuous, rigorous intellectual activity that was the library's true power was fractured. Imagine the sudden, unsettling silence in the dining hall, the emptiness in the lecture port, the sudden halt in the passionate, focused debates that had once defined the Mouseion. The systematic acquisition of new scrolls also began its slow, quiet decline. The relentless pursuit of every known text, the gold-backed mandate to search every ship, grew less rigorous, less urgent. The initial zeal gave way to bureaucratic fatigue. Agents became less effective. Budgets for acquisitions were quietly reduced, and the focus shifted from seeking all knowledge to merely maintaining existing knowledge. The flow of new ideas and foreign texts began to slow to a trickle, creating a subtle stagnation. The collection, though still vast and incomparable, ceased to be a dynamic, ever-expanding repository of current global thought. It began its quiet transformation from a living, breathing university into a massive, revered museum of past thought. The quality of the scribal work also began to suffer. The initial textual critics were men of genius and boundless dedication, meticulously establishing the true text. As the value placed on pure scholarship declined, the scribes who copied and recataloged the scrolls were sometimes less skilled, less careful. This introduced small, quiet errors into the authoritative texts, tiny corruptions that would accumulate over centuries, a slow, silent pollution of the wellspring of knowledge. The library was not yet in ruins, not yet physically destroyed. It was suffering a more insidious, more subtle form of decay. The quiet corrosion of its soul, the slow fading of its initial intellectual purpose. The institution was still structurally intact, still housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls, still a symbol of learning, but the passion was waning, the patronage was faltering, and the subtle, internal discipline that held the intellectual enterprise together was loosening. The scholars who remained were quieter, more cautious, their focus perhaps shifting from groundbreaking originality to the safer territory of commentary and compilation. The quiet sound of the papyrus turning, the soft scratching of the quill, continued, but the underlying purpose, the original, boundless ambition, had begun its slow, painful surrender to political mediocrity and fiscal pragmatism. The golden haze was fading, and a subtle, melancholic shadow was falling across the great, cool marble floors of the Mouseion. The gradual, internal corrosion of the library's purpose now met its first great external shock, a moment of sharp, sudden loss that would forever scar its reputation and history. This moment arrived in 48 BCE, not with a deliberate act of malice, but as a consequence of global power struggles that cared nothing for the quiet value of ancient texts. The central figure in this dramatic, unsettling chapter is Julius Caesar, who arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival, Pompey the Great, and soon became entangled in the volatile political machinations of the late Ptolemaic court, particularly the rivalry between the young Ptolemy XIII and his famous sister, Cleopatra. Caesar found himself trapped in the royal court of Alexandria by hostile forces. He realized he was surrounded, his position perilous. In a desperate, decisive act of self-defense, he ordered the burning of the Egyptian fleet anchored in the harbor to prevent his enemy from using it against him. The resulting fire, fierce and unpredictable, did not stay confined to the docks. It spread, fueled by the dry coastal wind and the proximity of the royal warehouses and arsenals. These warehouses, tragically, were not just filled with grain and military supplies. They were also the storage sites for a massive overflow collection of scrolls. A secondary library intended either for shipping or for eventually being copied and integrated into the main Mouseion collection. This fire, known in history as the Alexandrian War, delivered the first great, profound scar upon the library's magnificent body. The magnitude of the loss is debated by scholars to this day, but the consensus is that a staggering number of scrolls were consumed by the indiscriminate flames, perhaps tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, while the main library building and the Mouseion complex itself may have escaped direct destruction. The loss of this vital overflow collection was a cultural calamity of immense proportions. Imagine the frantic, chaotic scene. The heat of the fire, the acrid smoke billowing over the harbor, the desperate, silent realization of the scholars watching, powerless, as a lifetime of collected wisdom turned to ash. This was not the quiet, subtle decay of the past decades. This was a sharp, traumatic amputation of knowledge. The library had suffered a profound, irreversible loss, a sudden gap in its universal collection that could never truly be filled. The subsequent Roman victory under Caesar briefly restored some political stability to Alexandria, largely through the powerful, stabilizing presence of Cleopatra. The immediate political threat was lifted, but the deep cultural wound remained open. The quiet, constant work of the library now faced the immense task of assessing the damage, trying to catalog what was lost, and grappling with the profound psychological toll of the fire. The intellectual landscape had shifted. The library was no longer the symbol of invincibility and boundless acquisition. It was now a symbol of tragic vulnerability, a stark reminder that even the quietest sanctuary of knowledge was subject to the violent, unpredictable currents of the outside world. This loss, however, was not immediately terminal. The main collection was still largely intact, and the intellectual momentum, Tag Slahud, still existed. Furthermore, an attempt was made to symbolically and materially compensate for the loss. Later, Mark Antony, in an act of political and romantic deference to Cleopatra, reportedly gifted the library a collection of scrolls from the rival Pergamum library, a famous collection that numbered around 200,000 scrolls. This infusion of new texts was an act intended to restore the library's glory and numerical size, a grand, quiet gesture. However, even this gift was fraught with complexity. While the quantity was vast, the quality and originality of the texts are unknown, and the collection from Pergamum, a rival institution, may have simply duplicated existing Alexandrian holdings rather than filling the unique gaps created by the fire. The very act of replacing lost wisdom with a bulk gift highlights the fundamental change in the library's status. It was no longer the solitary, insatiable collector. It was now a recipient of political favors, its size and prestige subject to the quiet whims and grand gestures of powerful rulers. The fire, whether it destroyed the main building or only the subsidiary collection, marked a clear, undeniable transition. The library now moved from its golden age of Ptolemaic ascendancy into the long, slow, complex, and ultimately fatal decline under the heavy shadow of Roman imperial rule. The vast, cool halls of the Mouseion were now quieter. The scholars more mindful, their focus perhaps sharpened by the tragedy, but their collective spirit undeniably marked by the memory of the smoke and the ash. The first great, catastrophic silence in the heart of the world's knowledge. With the final collapse of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the formal incorporation of Egypt into the vast Roman Empire in 30 BCE, the Great Library entered a new, much longer phase of its decline. The era of Roman bureaucracy and intellectual detachment. The transition was not marked by violence, but by a quiet, profound shift in patronage and priority. For the Ptolemies, the library had been a symbol of national identity, a claim to Greek intellectual supremacy, a matter of personal, royal prestige. For the Roman emperors, however, the library was simply a grand, existing institution within a newly acquired province, a facility to be managed, maintained, and subjected to the quiet, rigid logic of Roman imperial administration. The passion was gone, replaced by procedure. The sheer, boundless intellectual ambition that founded the library was incompatible with the Roman focus on engineering, law, and military organization. The library's immense financial burden, once an investment in philosophical glory, became a manageable, but often begrudged, expense. Funding was not cut dramatically all at once, but slowly and consistently reduced. The Roman administration saw no need for the Ptolemies' lavish intellectual indulgence. The scholar stipends were reduced over time, their generous privileges slowly erode, their numbers allowed to dwindle through attrition without being fully replaced. Imagine the slow, quiet process. An old, revered scholar, pauses, away in his sleep, and his position in the Mouseion, once a highly coveted post filled immediately by a leading mind, is now left vacant for months, then years, due to budgetary review or administrative reorganization. This silent attrition of intellectual talent was a profound drain on the library's vitality. The rigorous intellectual output that defined the Golden Age slowed significantly. Roman patronage favored commentary, compilation, and the practical application of knowledge over the pure, abstract research that had once been the library's hallmark. New scholarly work increasingly focused on summarizing and cataloging the vast existing knowledge rather than generating genuinely new thought. The library, under the long shadow of Roman rule, began its final, slow transformation from a revolutionary research center into a magnificent, but essentially static, museum. The maintenance of the collection, the physical scrolls themselves, became a monumental, chronic problem. Papyrus is an organic material, fragile and susceptible to decay from insects, humidity, and the simple passage of time. The library's thousands upon thousands of scrolls required constant, meticulous conservation, reoiling, rewinding, repairing, and most crucially, recopying onto new, fresh papyrus. When the original text became too fragile or faded, this constant recopying process required an army of specialized scribes, a vast supply of high-quality papyrus, and a substantial, dedicated budget. Under the cold, distant eye of the Roman bureaucracy, the commitment to this grueling, expensive work wavered. The recopying schedule fell behind. Imagine the scribes, fewer in number and less well, working under dim light, the soft, scratching sound of their quills struggling to keep up with the slow, inevitable decay of the collection. The backlog grew, silently, relentlessly. Texts began to fade, their ink growing pale, their edges crumbling, their very knowledge gradually receding into a This was not a fire. It was a slow, quiet death by bureaucratic neglect and physical entropy. The library's primary collection, while still awe-inspiring in size, began to suffer a decline in quality and accessibility. Texts were incomplete, damaged, or simply too fragile to be handled and studied. The search for new acquisitions ceased entirely. Instead of sending out agents with gold to purchase unique texts, the Roman administration simply maintained the status quo, viewing the collection as sufficiently complete. The spirit of boundless intellectual ambition was replaced by the stultifying, quiet complacency of administrative inertia. The library, once the engine of world thought, was now merely a beautiful, quiet monument to its own past glory, its vast halls filled with the profound, melancholic silence of potential left unrealized, and knowledge slowly, sadly receding into the long shadow of history. As the Great Library of Alexandria slowly yielded to the creeping decay of Roman neglect, a new, younger institution rose to quiet prominence. A library that represented a fundamental shift in both location and purpose. This complementary, or daughter, library had been established much earlier, situated within the massive, magnificent temple complex dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapeum, a deity created by the Ptolemies to unite their Greek and Egyptian subjects. The Serapeum library was often referred to as the daughter library, while it never rivaled the sheer size of the Mouseion's main collection. Its physical setting and its eventual fate illustrate the profound changes overtaking Alexandrian intellectual life. The Serapeum was designed not purely as a research center, but as an integral part of a religious sanctuary. Its location within the vast, heavily fortified temple complex gave it a degree of physical and, later, ideological protection that the older, secular Mouseion complex lacked. Its collection, while smaller, was significant, often holding duplicates of texts from the main collection and specializing in certain areas, particularly those related to Egyptian religion and culture. This division of the city's intellectual mind into two distinct locations, the secular Mouseion and the sacred Serapeum, represented a growing tension within Alexandrian culture. As Roman rule settled in, the Mouseion became increasingly identified with pure, abstract Greek scholarship, a tradition that was slowly receding from the forefront of global thought. The Serapeum, however, maintained a stronger connection to the local Egyptian culture and, critically, became more entangled with the spiritual and religious life of the populace. This subtle, quiet shift in focus from cold, analytical reason to warmer, mystical belief was a hallmark of the later Roman Empire and foreshadowed the ultimate struggles that would bring down the classical world. The competition for resources and prestige between the two institutions was often subtle but continuous. As funding for the main library diminished under Roman management, the site, often supported by religious endowments and local patronage, maintained a slightly more stable financial footing, though it too suffered from the overall intellectual decline of the city. The scholars who worked in the Serapeum, while equally devoted to the texts, often approached them with a slightly different lens, viewing the ancient wisdom through a filter of burgeoning philosophical and religious syncretism. Imagine the contrast. The Great Library, immense and quiet, filled with the pervasive smell of old, crumbling papyrus and the melancholic silence of scholars lamenting the decline. The Serapeum, perhaps smaller but vibrant, with the quiet hum of ritual activity, the fragrance of incense mingling with the scent of scrolls, the feeling of a more immediate, engaged connection to the spiritual world. The decline of the main library was further exacerbated by this division of resources and focus. The ideal of a single, unified, universal collection was fractured. The main library's losses, whether from the fire or from bureaucratic neglect, could no longer be instantly compensated for by a single, powerful patron. The intellectual energy of the city was now diffused, its focus split. The Serapeum, with its religious connection, was poised to become the last, fragile bastion of Alexandrian learning in the tumultuous later centuries, but this very connection also made it a target. Its fate would ultimately be tied to the violent, quiet clash between the ancient world's religious traditions and the rising, assertive power of Christianity. The slow, quiet death of the Great Library was therefore not a simple process of decay, but a complex, layered decline involving intellectual stagnation, political neglect, and a subtle, internal competition from its own daughter institution, a competition that reflected the profound, irreversible division of the Alexandrian mind itself. The separation of these two great collections was a quiet, profound tragedy, a fracturing of the ideal of universal knowledge that would leave the city's intellectual defense, vulnerable to the storms of religious and political violence yet to come. Let us now turn our quiet attention away from the grand sweep of history and the distant politics of Rome, focusing instead on the most intimate aspect of the library's decline, the slow, quiet suffering of the scrolls themselves and the desperate, often Sisyphean task of the scribes charged with their preservation. The papyrus scroll, the very vessel of all that knowledge, was a creature of profound fragility. It was made from thin strips of the papyrus plant, laminated and pressed, creating a surprisingly resilient, yet fundamentally organic, material. But papyrus is mortal. It is susceptible to every enemy of knowledge. The persistent, minute gnawing of bookworms and silverfish, the destructive, cumulative humidity of the coastal air, the simple, slow oxidation that fades the ink and embrittles the fibers, and the relentless mechanical wear and tear from repeated, careful handling over centuries. The scrolls in the Mouseion, though stored with immense care, faced a continuous, silent siege from these forces of entropy. The air in the vast storage rooms, once perfectly managed by the dedication of the early Ptolemies, became less rigorously controlled. The cedar oil used to condition the papyrus and deter insects was less frequently applied. The meticulous system of rotation and repair began to break down. Imagine a scribe, now paid a smaller, often delayed, stipend, working in a quiet corner. He handles a revered, 300-year-old copy of a play by Sophocles. As he gently unrolls it, a section cracks, a line of text flakes away, and a single, ancient word is lost forever. A quiet, irreparable wound to the dramatic tradition. The primary task of the scribes was therefore not just to copy new texts, but to engage in constant, meticulous recopying of the old. This was a grueling, expensive, and never-ending process. A master scribe would unroll the deteriorating original, while a team of copyists would painstakingly transcribe the text onto fresh, new papyrus. The process demanded absolute concentration, impeccable hand-eye coordination, and an intimate familiarity with the ancient Greek script. The cost of this process was astronomical. The expense of new, high-quality papyrus, the cost of the raw materials for permanent ink, and the salaries of the large corps of highly skilled copyists. As the library's funding dwindled under Roman rule, this vital engine of preservation slowed. The quality of the new papyrus was sometimes lower, the ink less permanent, and the scribes themselves, fewer in number and less meticulously trained, were more prone to error. The backlog of scrolls awaiting recopying grew into a mountainous, insurmountable problem. Imagine the long, silent rows of scrolls tagged for urgent recopying, scrolls containing unique treatises on astronomy, medicine, or obscure philosophy simply sitting on a shelf, slowly, quietly decaying the text, fading the edges, turning brittle, their voices softly receding into silence. The decline of the collection was therefore not a single event, but a slow, quiet death by 1,000 cuts. The library's collection suffered not from a lack of care, but from a fatal shortage of resources to maintain the care required by such a massive, fragile undertaking. The sheer volume of scrolls, once its greatest strength, became its ultimate liability in an era of decreasing patronage. Every damaged scroll, every faded line, every unrepaired tear represented a small, quiet defeat for the cause of universal knowledge. The quiet suffering of the papyrus, the slow, chemical breakdown of the organic material, was the true, unsung tragedy of the library's decline. It was a tragedy of entropy, a poignant reminder that even the deepest, most profound knowledge is subject to the relentless, silent hostility of time and decay. The quiet sound of the crumbling scroll, the soft scratching of the quill struggling to keep up. These were the melancholic, enduring sounds of the library's final centuries. As the internal struggle to maintain the physical integrity of the existing scrolls intensified, an equally damaging process unfolded on the intellectual side of the library's life, the fading of new ideas and the decline in the quality of new acquisitions. The Golden Age was characterized by the boundless pursuit of original thought, the vigorous debates, the mathematical breakthroughs, and the scientific experimentation. Under the Roman shadow, this spirit slowly, quietly evaporated, replaced by a deep reverence for the past that bordered on intellectual paralysis. The scholars of the later library often focused on compilation and commentary, a safe, meticulous form of scholarship that involved organizing, summarizing, and writing explanations of the great works of the past. The original texts of the classics, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, were considered perfect and complete, demanding only explication, not challenge or advancement. Imagine the quiet transformation. The passionate, original thinker is replaced by the meticulous, organized catalog. The revolutionary mathematician is replaced by the careful, dedicated commentator on Euclid. The intellectual energy was turned inward, focused on perfectly arranging and explaining the inherited knowledge, rather than launching outward into the unknown. New acquisitions, when they occurred, were less about revolutionary ideas from distant lands, and more about acquiring authoritative, established works of the classical tradition. The Mouseion ceased to be a true universal collector, prioritizing Greek and Latin texts over the unique philosophical, astronomical, and mathematical texts emerging from Persia, India, or other distant cultures. The library's scope, once global, quietly contracted, reflecting the shrinking intellectual horizon of the late Roman world. The decline in the quality of new thought meant that even the works being created within Alexandria were often less vibrant than the scrolls that were decaying on the shelves. The intellectual life of the city became heavily weighted toward preservation, not creation. This quiet, intellectual stagnation was a profound tragedy, perhaps more damaging than any physical destruction. A library that stops acquiring new ideas and generating original research is not truly alive. It is a Mouseion, a magnificent collection of monuments to past genius. The very function of the Mouseion, once defined by its forward-looking research, began to be defined by its backward-looking reverence. Furthermore, the physical process of knowledge creation was itself subject to the subtle decline of the era. the papyrus being produced in Egypt, the primary raw material, began to decrease in quality as the papyrus industry faced economic pressures. The ink, too, suffered. The most durable inks of the Golden Age, often made from complex carbon-based formulas, were sometimes replaced by cheaper, less permanent, iron gall inks that could subtly corrode the papyrus over time. Even the simple tools of scholarship, the precise rulers, the quality quills, the lighting in the study rooms may have experienced a slow, quiet degradation. The ultimate irony of the library's decline is that its vastness became its doom. The sheer volume of knowledge demanded an intellectual vitality and a financial commitment that the later, less inspired rulers were unwilling to provide. The library was slowly, quietly suffocated by the weight of its own magnificent past. The silence in the reading rooms, once the silence of intense concentration, became the quiet of diminishing intellectual activity. A melancholic quietude that was the signature of a genius slowly, sadly receding. As the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era unfolded, a new and immensely powerful force began to sweep across the Roman world, profoundly altering the quiet intellectual landscape of Alexandria and setting the stage for the library's final violent chapters. This force was the rising tide of Christianity, which, having endured centuries of persecution, was now becoming a recognized den dominant, and finally the exclusive state religion of the Roman Empire. The establishment of Christianity as the official religion created a fundamental, quiet clash of ideals with the Hellenistic, pagan intellectual tradition that was the very foundation of the Great Library. The library, with its hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was a repository of pagan thought, Greek mythology, philosophical treatises that questioned the nature of divinity, scientific texts that contradicted biblical creation stories, and historical works that honored the great pagan emperors. To the increasingly zealous Christian community, these scrolls were not merely literature or science. They were instruments of idolatry, symbols of a false, corrupt, and dangerous past that needed to be purged. The intellectual debate was replaced by a dangerous, quiet tension. The scholars of the Mouseion, the keepers of the pagan texts, found themselves increasingly isolated, their quiet pursuit of classical knowledge viewed with suspicion, sometimes outright hostility. The atmosphere in Alexandria, once famed for its diverse intellectual tolerance, grew heavy with religious zealotry. The quiet, methodical work of the philologoi became a politically and religiously dangerous activity. The most dramatic and well-documented climax of this clash centered on the Serapeum, the daughter library and temple complex. In 391 CE, under the decree of the Christian emperor Theodosius, the first who had banned all forms of public pagan worship, the Serapeum was targeted. The event was catalyzed by a local, violent conflict. A Christian mob, led by Theophilus, the fiercely zealous bishop of Alexandria, stormed the temple complex. The massive structure, a testament to Greco-Egyptian religious syncretism, was systematically looted and destroyed. The vast statue of Serapis was toppled and smashed, a symbolic act of profound religious and cultural destruction. The fate of the Serapeum's scrolls is a matter of profound and terrible debate. Some accounts claim that the books were contemptuously destroyed or burned by the mob, seen as relics of pagan heresy. Others suggest that the collection was simply dispersed or moved to safer locations within the city, perhaps into churches or private collections, the books themselves surviving the mob's ire. Regardless of the exact fate of the Serapeum's scrolls, the physical destruction of the temple complex was an undeniable, catastrophic act of cultural violence. The destruction of the Serapeum shattered the quiet, continuous tradition of Alexandrian scholarship. The loss of its vast collection, coupled with the political climate that made pagan learning a capital offense, created an atmosphere of terror and profound intellectual chill. The main library and Mouseion complex, by this point largely secular and physically separated from the religious structure of the Serapeum, was already a shadow of its former self, its intellectual vitality sapped by centuries of neglect and attrition. But the violence of 391 CE served as a clear, undeniable, and terrifying public declaration. The pursuit of classical, secular, or pagan knowledge was no longer safe, no longer sanctioned, no longer tolerated. The scholars who remained went into quiet hiding, their scrolls tucked away in private homes, the intellectual life of the city driven underground. The Mouseion complex, already quiet, fell into an even deeper, more profound silence, its former purpose now entirely superseded by the volatile, unpredictable currents of religious and political power. The long, slow decline had reached its violent, devastating nadir. The violent destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE marked the practical end of the Great Library of Alexandria as an institution of world-class scholarship. Even if the physical structure of the main Mouseion complex may have survived for a time, the violence was not an attack on the building, but an attack on the ideal it represented. The profound cultural and political shock that followed was a fatal blow. The vast, cool halls of the Mouseion, which had already seen decades of intellectual stagnation and declining resources, now faced an insurmountable crisis of legitimacy and safety. The remaining scholars, the philologoi who still clung to the classical tradition, were forced to make a stark choice. They could renounce their pagan learning, embrace the new faith, and attempt to adapt their scholarship to the new Christian orthodoxy, or they could quietly flee, taking their most precious scrolls and their deep knowledge, with them seeking refuge in the safer intellectual centers of the Byzantine East, such as Constantinople or Antioch. The quiet mass exodus that followed was the final, devastating brain drain. The intellectual community of the Mouseion dissolved not in a storm of fire, but in a gradual, silent scattering of individual scholars carrying their most cherished texts in quiet, desperate flight. The salaries and privileges that had once lured the greatest minds of the ancient world were gone, replaced by the omnipresent threat of mob violence and political persecution. The institution of the Mouseion, which required a vast corps of dedicated, financially secure scholars to function, simply ceased to exist as an organized, state-sponsored university. The grand structure, the famed lecture halls, the dining facility, the research chambers all fell into disuse. The vast space, once filled with the quiet energy of debate and discovery, became an empty, echoing shell. The most devastating consequence was the fate of the remaining scrolls. Without the constant flow of state funds, without the dedicated personnel, and without the intellectual imperative to maintain the collection, the remaining texts were left to the relentless, silent hostility of time and decay. The papyrus, already old and fragile, was no longer oiled or repaired. The backlog of recopying, already decades behind, became an impossible task. The environmental control, once meticulously managed, lapsed entirely. The scrolls were left exposed to the damp, humid coastal air, vulnerable to insects and the slow, inexorable rot. The quiet sound of the papyrus turning and the scribe's quill scratching was replaced by the silence of the empty hall, broken only by the sound of scuttling vermin, the soft sigh of the wind through the high windows, and the quiet crumbling of the ancient material itself. The massive collection, accumulated over 7 centuries, did not disappear in a sudden fire. It suffered a prolonged, quiet, agonizing death by attrition, decay, and neglect. The physical existence of the Mouseion complex eventually faded into obscurity. Later, historical accounts mention its ruins, but its function as a library ceased entirely. The finality of its disappearance was not a dramatic ending, but a slow, quiet surrender to the forces of entropy. The Great Library of Alexandria, the magnificent symbol of boundless intellectual ambition, died not in flames, but in the profound, quiet silence of indifference and neglect. Its final story, a tragic, enduring lesson about the fragility of human knowledge when detached from a protected, vital, and well-funded community of dedicated scholars. The ultimate fate of the Great Library of Alexandria, therefore, lies not in a single, convenient date of destruction, but in a complex web of events spanning centuries. It was not destroyed once, but suffered a long, quiet, agonizing death in several stages. The slow corrosion of Ptolemaic patronage, the sharp amputation of the Caesar fire, the long shadow of Roman bureaucratic neglect, and the final, fatal cultural violence of the late imperial era. The library did not meet a single, dramatic end. It suffered a prolonged, quiet disintegration. By the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, the Mouseion complex, if it still stood, was merely a shadow. A field of impressive ruble, an architectural reminder of a glory long past. The knowledge it once contained was scattered, lost, or absorbed into other, newer institutions across the globe. Yet, the library's true legacy is not defined by its physical demise, but by the quiet, indelible mark it left upon the entire trajectory of Western thought. The library's greatest triumph was its quiet, meticulous work of textual preservation and standardization. Without the dedicated scholars of the Mouseion, the foundational texts of Western civilization, the works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and the great tragedians would have been lost, fragmented, or preserved in hopelessly corrupted forms. The scholars of Alexandria, in their quiet, painstaking work of comparison and editing, provided the authoritative versions of these texts that would survive the centuries of turmoil, eventually to be copied by Byzantine monks, translated by Arab scholars, and rediscovered by the Renaissance world. The library's spirit lived on in the creation of the very concept of the modern research university. The Mouseion was a self-sustaining intellectual community, providing stipends, accommodation, and the resources necessary for dedicated, full-time scholarship. This model of institutionalized research, detached from the immediate need for profit or political allegiance, was revolutionary. Though the institution itself perished, the idea of the Mouseiantha commitment to universal knowledge and the rigorous pursuit of truth survived and was quietly reborn. Centuries later, in the medieval universities and the modern research institutions of today, the scattered scrolls that survived the violence and the neglect were not truly lost. They were merely relocated. They traveled east with fleeing scholars, finding sanctuary in the burgeoning intellectual centers of the Arab world, where their knowledge was studied, translated, and built upon by Muslim scholars during the Islamic Golden Age. The quiet, profound continuity of learning was maintained through these scattered fragments in the memory of the Mouseion immense catalogue. The decline of the Great Library of Alexandria serves as a poignant, quiet, and timeless warning. It demonstrates that the greatest threat to knowledge is not a single, violent act, but the slow, quiet erosion of the institutional will to maintain it. It teaches us that knowledge is profoundly fragile, requiring constant, meticulous care, sustained funding, and a deep, continuous commitment from the highest levels of society. The silence that fell over the Mouseion complex was not merely the silence of a building falling into ruin. It was the silence of a civilization that had momentarily lost its devotion to its own intellectual past. Yet, even in the silence, the echo of the Mouseion remains, acquires powerful voice reminding us that the preservation of knowledge is not a task for a single generation, but a continuous, sacred duty to all who follow. The decline of the Great Library of Alexandria was mirrored and compounded by a quiet, subtle, yet immensely significant economic shift that affected the very medium of knowledge itself. The slow, agonizing decline of the Egyptian papyrus trade and the subsequent rise of the codex. The existence of the library, with its hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was entirely dependent on the continuous mass production of high-quality papyrus, a new monopoly of the Nile Valley. This trade was a cornerstone of the Egyptian economy and a vital necessity for the entire scholarly world. But as the Roman Empire weakened, and as Egypt's political and economic stability eroded, the massive papyrus industry began its slow, quiet collapse. The production of the finest grade papyrus became more expensive, more inconsistent, and the overall volume of output declined dramatically. This meant that the library, even if it had maintained its funding, would have struggled to find the necessary quantity and quality of raw material for the crucial recopying of its vast collection. Imagine the quiet dilemma of the later librarians. They might have the funds, but the papyrus, itself the very body of the scroll, was either prohibitively expensive or simply unavailable in the required quality. This scarcity exacerbated the backlog of decaying texts, accelerating the silent, physical destruction of the collection. The decline of papyrus was hastened by the gradual, practical superiority of a new format. The codex, essentially the ancestor of the modern book, with individual sheets bound together and covered, offered several distinct advantages over the long, cumbersome scroll. A codex was easier to handle, more robust, easier to search, and could hold text on both sides of the page, drastically reducing the amount of raw material required. This new format was championed by the Christian communities, who found the codex much better suited for handling, hiding, and referencing sacred texts in their often persecuted existence. The growing preference for the codex meant that fewer scribes were trained in the meticulous art of preparing, writing, and copying on scrolls, and the entire infrastructure of the scroll world began to quiet and disappear. As the papyrus trade waned and the codex gained dominance, the library's vast collection of scrolls became a monument to a rapidly receding past. The technology of preservation itself had shifted, leaving the Mouseion's physical form designed entirely around the scroll obsolete. The remaining scrolls were difficult to repair, difficult to copy onto a new format, and increasingly viewed as archaic relics. The slow, quiet death of the library was therefore intertwined with the slow, quiet death of the papyrus scroll itself. The library did not just lose its patrons and its scholars, it lost the very material foundation of its existence. The final silence that fell over the storage rooms was the silence of material exhaustion, the silence of a vast collection that had simply run out of the economic and logistical resources required to keep its fragile contents alive. The history of the great libraries, thus also the history of the materials of knowledge, a profound reminder that ideas, however brilliant, require a secure, stable, and well-funded material vessel to survive the long, relentless, quiet march of time. Our long, slow journey into the decline of the Great Library of Alexandria now reaches its conclusion, a conclusion marked not by a definitive endpoint, but by the profound, enduring silence that follows a great loss. The final decades of the library were defined by this silence, a quiet, melancholic atmosphere that had utterly replaced the vibrant, passionate clamor of its golden age. The magnificent institution, founded on the grandest intellectual vision in history, was quietly surrendered to neglect, religious turmoil, and the relentless pressure of time. The physical remnants of the Mouseion complex eventually faded into the rich, complex rubble of ancient Alexandria. No single, final conqueror claims the singular glory of its destruction. Rather, its demise was a collective tragedy shared by 7 centuries of faltering commitment. The knowledge that the library so painstakingly collected, however, was not annihilated. It was scattered, fragmented, and absorbed, becoming a hidden tributary flowing into the great rivers of later knowledge. The scholars who fled Alexandria carried their scrolls, their methodologies, and the memory of the library's immense organization to new lands. The true inheritance of Alexandria scholars was the very method of scholarship itself, the rigorous approach to textual criticism, the systematic organization of knowledge, and the concept of a multidisciplinary research institution. This quiet methodology, refined in the Mouseion, continued to shape the intellectual life of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds for centuries. The ultimate quiet tragedy of the Great Library lies in the incalculable number of unique texts that were lost forever. The single, irreplaceable copies of obscure philosophical works, lost histories, and detailed scientific observations that simply decayed on the shelf, their ink fading, their papyrus crumbling. The silence that now rests over the ancient site is the silence of those lost voices, the unheard wisdom that will never speak again. Yet, the memory of the library, even in its decline, endures as a timeless, profound warning. It is a quiet lesson in intellectual fragility, a reminder that the preservation of knowledge is an active, demanding duty, not a passive right. The immense wealth of the Ptolemies could build the library, but only sustained intellectual passion, political stability, and meticulous care could preserve it. The long, slow decline of the Mouseion is a story of a great ideal quietly succumbing to human frailty, to the slow corrosion of indifference, and to the inevitable political and religious storms of a changing world. It is a story that, even today, in its profound, ancient silence, speaks volumes about the value of knowledge, and the quiet, persistent effort required to keep the lamp of learning burning through the long night of history. We are left with the gentle echo of the silent, vast scroll rooms, a quiet memory of a world where all knowledge was once intended to be one. A magnificent, beautiful vision that, though ultimately lost, continues to inspire the quiet, ceaseless work of scholarship to this very day.